The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Sarah Chun adjusted her service dog's harness one final time before pushing open the glass door of Bella Vista Cafe. The familiar weight of Atlas, her German shepherd, pressed against her left leg, a constant reminder of the battles she'd fought and the one she was still fighting. The cafe's bell chimed softly, a welcoming sound that would soon become the opening note of a confrontation that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Atlas wore his official service dog vest, complete with patches identifying him as a working animal. But Sarah knew from experience that visible credentials didn't always translate to understanding. She'd learned to read rooms quickly, to assess whether she'd be welcomed or whether she'd need to educate someone about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Today, something in the air felt different, charged with the kind of tension that reminded her of patrol missions in Afghanistan. The hostess, a young woman with kind eyes and a nervous smile, approached them immediately. Sarah noticed how the girl's gaze flicked between her and Atlas, clearly unsure of protocol but wanting to do the right thing. Sarah appreciated that hesitation. It showed respect rather than ignorance. "Table for one?" the hostess asked, her voice gentle but uncertain. "Yes, please," Sarah replied, keeping her tone warm. She'd learned that approaching these situations with defensiveness only made things worse. "Somewhere quiet if you have it." The hostess nodded and grabbed a menu, leading them toward a corner booth away from the main dining area. Sarah followed, Atlas moving in perfect sync beside her, his training evident in every measured step. The dog's presence had become as natural as breathing, a living extension of her own awareness, constantly monitoring their environment for threats both visible and invisible. As they settled into the booth, Sarah allowed herself a moment of optimism. The cafe was charming, with exposed brick walls and local artwork creating an atmosphere of community warmth. The scent of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, and the gentle murmur of conversation from other diners suggested this was the kind of place where people came to feel connected. Atlas positioned himself under the table, his body alert but relaxed, ready to respond if needed, but content to let his handler take the lead. Sarah had discovered Bella Vista Cafe 3 weeks earlier while exploring her new neighborhood. After 8 years of military service, including 2 tours in Afghanistan, she was still adjusting to civilian life. The transition had been more challenging than she'd anticipated, not just because of the physical injuries that had ended her military career, but because of the invisible wounds that Atlas helped her navigate. Post-traumatic stress disorder had a way of making even simple activities feel like military operations, requiring careful planning and strategic thinking. The cafe had become part of her routine, a safe space where she could practice being around people without the hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat zones. She'd been coming here twice a week, usually during off-peak hours when the crowds were manageable. The staff had been consistently friendly, the other patrons largely indifferent to her presence, and the coffee was exceptional. It was exactly the kind of unremarkable normalcy she'd been seeking. But today was different. Today, she'd arrived during the lunch rush, and the cafe buzzed with energy that made her skin prickle with awareness. Atlas sensed her tension immediately, his ears perking slightly as he monitored her breathing and heart rate. The dog had been trained to recognize the early signs of a panic attack, to provide pressure therapy when needed, and to create space between Sarah and potential triggers. He was more than a companion, he was a highly skilled medical device that happened to have 4 legs and unconditional loyalty. Sarah opened her menu and tried to focus on the selections, but her attention kept drifting to the conversations around her. A business meeting at the table to her right, where 3 men in suits discussed quarterly projections. A mother and teenage daughter sharing dessert at the window table, their laughter bright and genuine. an elderly couple near the counter, holding hands across their table as they shared a newspaper. These were the moments she'd fought to protect ordinary people living ordinary lives, free from the fear and violence that had defined her world for so long. A server approached their table, and Sarah looked up to see a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a professional smile. The woman's name tag read Janet, and she carried herself with the efficient confidence of someone who'd been in the restaurant industry for years. Sarah noticed how Janet's gaze lingered on Atlas, but there was no judgment in her expression, only curiosity and perhaps a hint of recognition. "Good afternoon," Janet said, pulling out her order pad. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" "Coffee, please," Sarah replied. "Black. And for your friend?" Janet asked, gesturing toward Atlas with a smile that seemed genuine. Sarah appreciated the woman's attempt at humor. "He's on duty, so just water if you have a bowl." Janet nodded and jotted down the order. "Military?" "Marine Corps," Sarah confirmed, surprised by the question. Most people didn't make that connection so quickly. "My son just finished his first deployment," Janet said, her voice carrying a mother's pride mixed with relief. "Afghanistan. He's told me about the dogs over there, said they were angels with 4 legs. Sarah felt something ease in her chest. "He's not wrong. Atlas here saved my life more times than I can count." "Then he's earned his place at any table in this restaurant," Janet said firmly. "I'll get that coffee and water right out." As Janet walked away, Sarah allowed herself to relax slightly. The interaction had gone better than she'd hoped, and she felt the familiar gratitude for those who understood without needing lengthy explanations. Atlas remained calm and alert, his presence a steadying force that allowed her to exist in the moment without constantly scanning for threats. The coffee arrived quickly, along with a small bowl of water that Janet placed discreetly beside the table. Sarah thanked her and took a sip, savoring the rich flavor and the simple pleasure of a well-made cup. She was reaching for her menu when she noticed a shift in the cafe's atmosphere, conversations becoming quieter, heads turning toward the front of the restaurant. A tall man in expensive suit was speaking loudly to the hostess, his voice carrying across the dining room despite his apparent attempts to keep the conversation private. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably aggressive. The hostess kept glancing in Sarah's direction, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious distress. Atlas lifted his head slightly, his ears rotating toward the commotion. Sarah placed a calming hand on his neck, feeling the slight tension in his muscles. The dog's training had taught him to differentiate between normal human interaction and potential threats, and something about the situation had caught his attention. The man in the suit finished his conversation with the hostess and began walking purposefully toward their table. Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. Assess the threat, identify escape routes, prepare for confrontation. She straightened in her seat, one hand remaining on Atlas while the other moved to her lap, ready to respond if necessary. The man approaching them was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from years of being in charge. His suit was tailored and expensive, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. Everything about his appearance suggested success and authority, but Sarah had learned to read people beyond their exteriors. There was something in his posture that reminded her of the officers, who'd never seen combat but enjoyed wielding power over those who had. "Excuse me," the man said as he reached their table, his voice carrying the kind of forced politeness that barely concealed irritation. "I'm Marcus Wellington, the owner of this establishment." Sarah nodded politely, keeping her expression neutral. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wellington. I'm Sarah Chun." "Miss Chun," Wellington continued, his gaze pointedly avoiding Atlas, "I'm afraid we have a situation here. Several of my patrons have expressed concerns about the animal in the dining area." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her voice steady. "Atlas is a service dog, Mr. Wellington. He's legally permitted to accompany me in public establishments. I understand there are laws, Wellington said, his tone suggesting he found those laws inconvenient. But I also have a responsibility to ensure the comfort and safety of all my customers. Some people are afraid of dogs, regardless of their training. The way he said training made it clear he had doubts about both Atlas's qualifications and Sarah's need for assistance. Sarah had heard this tone before, the barely concealed skepticism that questioned whether her disabilities were real, whether her dog was legitimate, whether she deserved the accommodations that had been legally guaranteed. Mr. Wellington, Sarah said, keeping her voice calm and professional, Atlas is a fully trained service dog. He's not a pet or an emotional support animal. He's a medical device that helps me manage my service-connected disabilities. Under the ADA, he has the right to accompany me in any public establishment. Wellington's expression hardened slightly. I'm not questioning your condition, Miss Chun, but I am questioning whether this is the appropriate venue for such arrangements. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable ordering takeout. The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd faced enemy fire, improvised explosive devices, and the horrors of combat. But there was something particularly cruel about being told she didn't belong in a place as simple and ordinary as a neighborhood cafe. Atlas sensed her distress. Immediately, pressing closer against her leg in the subtle way he'd been trained to provide comfort. I'm not interested in takeout, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. I'm interested in eating lunch in a public restaurant, which is my right as an American citizen and a disabled veteran. Wellington's jaw tightened. Look, I respect your service, I really do. But I have a business to run, and I can't have animals disrupting my customers' dining experience. Surely you can understand that. What I understand, Sarah replied, is that you're asking me to leave because of my disability. That's not just illegal, Mr. Wellington, it's discrimination. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah could feel the attention of other diners focusing on their table, conversations pausing as people strained to hear what was happening. She hated being the center of attention, but she'd learned that sometimes standing up for yourself meant accepting the discomfort of being seen. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Wellington glanced around the restaurant, clearly aware that their conversation was being overheard. When he spoke again, his voice was lower but no less firm. This isn't about discrimination, Miss Chun. It's about business. I've built this restaurant over 15 years, and I know what works and what doesn't. Dog service dogs, whatever, they make people uncomfortable. They shed, they drool, they can be unpredictable. I can't afford to lose customers over one person's special needs. Sarah felt a familiar rage building in her chest, the same anger that had sustained her through combat and the long recovery afterward. But she'd learned to channel that anger into something more productive than violence. Mr. Wellington, Atlas doesn't shed, drool, or behave unpredictably. He's been trained to the highest standards by professionals who understand both canine behavior and human needs. He's cleaner and better behaved than most of the people in this restaurant. That may be true, Wellington said, but perception is reality in this business. And the perception is that you're bringing an animal into a food establishment where it doesn't belong. Sarah stood up slowly, Atlas immediately adjusting his position to maintain contact with her leg. She was taller than Wellington had expected, and her military bearing gave her a presence that commanded attention. Mr. Wellington, I've spent 8 years defending this country and the freedoms that allow you to run your business. I've been injured in that service, and I've earned the right to accommodations that help me function in civilian life. Atlas isn't just a dog, he's a highly trained medical device that helps me manage PTSD, mobility issues, and other service-connected disabilities. Wellington crossed his arms, his expression unyielding. And I appreciate that service, Miss Chen, but this is my establishment. And I have the right to maintain standards that protect my business and my customers. Your standards, Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of leadership under pressure, are discriminatory and illegal. The Americans with Disabilities Act guarantees my right to public accommodation, and that includes the right to be accompanied by my service dog. The IDA also allows business owners to refuse service if animals pose a threat to health or safety, Wellington countered. And I'm making the determination that this situation poses such a threat. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded a panic attack. The confrontation, the attention, the feeling of being under siege, it all combined to trigger the hypervigilance that had been her survival mechanism in combat. Atlas sensed the change immediately, moving to position himself between Sarah and Wellington while maintaining the unobtrusive presence that marked him as a professional working dog. What threat? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil. Inside her, Atlas is lying quietly under the table. He hasn't moved, hasn't made a sound, hasn't interacted with anyone except me. What exactly about his presence threatens the health or safety of your customers? Wellington's expression revealed his discomfort with the question. Dogs carry diseases. They can bite without warning. They're unpredictable. I can't take the risk, Mr. Wellington, Sarah said. Atlas has been health tested, vaccinated, and certified. He's undergone thousands of hours of training, specifically designed to make him predictable and reliable. He's been trained to ignore distractions, to avoid contact with other people, and to focus solely on his handler's needs. He's literally more predictable than any human in this restaurant. That's your opinion, Wellington said. But I'm not willing to stake my business on it. Sarah looked around the restaurant, noting how other diners were watching the confrontation with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort to outright hostility. She realized that Wellington had calculated this moment, carefully creating a public confrontation that would make her feel isolated and exposed, hoping she'd choose to leave rather than continue fighting. Mr. Wellington, she said, her voice carrying across the dining room, I want to make sure I understand your position. You're asking me to leave this restaurant because I'm disabled and require the assistance of a service dog. Is that correct? Wellington's face flushed slightly. I'm asking you to leave because you're disrupting my establishment with an animal that makes other customers uncomfortable. An animal that is legally recognized as medical equipment, Sarah clarified. Would you ask someone to leave because their wheelchair made other customers uncomfortable? Would you refuse service to someone because their oxygen tank was disruptive? That's different, Wellington said, but his voice lacked conviction. How is it different? Sarah pressed. Atlas provides medical assistance that I need to function in public spaces. He's not a pet, he's not a comfort animal, he's a working medical device. Asking me to leave because of his presence is exactly the same as asking someone to leave because they use a wheelchair or a hearing aid. Wellington's jaw worked as he searched for a response. Around them, the restaurant had fallen nearly silent, other diners openly watching the confrontation. Sarah could see some people nodding in agreement with her words, while others looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. Look, Wellington said finally, I don't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be. But I have a responsibility to my other customers, and several of them have expressed concerns about dining in the same room as a large dog. I'm sure you can understand their perspective. What I understand, Sarah said, is that you're prioritizing the comfort of customers who have prejudices over the legal rights of a disabled veteran. You're choosing to discriminate rather than educate. Wellington's expression hardened. Ms. Chun, I'm going to ask you one more time to leave voluntarily. If you refuse, I'll have to call the police. The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt Atlas press more firmly against her leg, his training telling him that his handler was under stress and might need intervention. She placed a calming hand on his head, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Mr. Wellington," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that had served her well in combat. "If you call the police, they'll inform you that you're violating federal law. The 8A doesn't give you the right to refuse service to someone because of their disability, and it doesn't give you the right to exclude service dogs from public accommodations." "We'll see about that," Wellington said, pulling out his phone. Sarah watched him dial, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. She'd hoped that her explanation would be enough, that Wellington would recognize the legitimacy of her need and the illegality of his position. Instead, he was doubling down on discrimination, apparently confident that his authority as a business owner superseded federal law. As Wellington spoke quietly into his phone, Sarah became aware of the conversation starting up around them. She could hear fragments of discussion, some people defending her right to be there, others expressing concern about dogs in restaurants, still others debating the merits of service animals versus emotional support animals. The cafe had become a microcosm of the broader cultural debates about disability rights, public accommodation, and the invisible nature of many disabilities. Atlas remained perfectly still throughout the commotion, his training allowing him to maintain his composure despite the stress radiating from his handler and the tension in the room. Sarah drew comfort from his steadiness, remembering the countless times his presence had anchored her through difficult moments. He was more than a service dog. He was a partner, a guardian, and a bridge between the world of her military service and the civilian life she was still learning to navigate. Wellington finished his call and returned to the table, his expression suggesting he felt vindicated. "The police are on their way," he said. "I'm sure they'll be able to resolve this situation appropriately." Sarah nodded calmly. "I'm sure they will, Mr. Wellington, and I'm sure they'll be very interested to hear about your refusal to accommodate a disabled veteran and her service dog." Wellington's confidence wavered slightly. "I'm not refusing to accommodate anyone. I'm maintaining standards that protect all my customers." "Standards that violate federal law," Sarah pointed out. "Mr. Wellington, I've been coming to this cafe for 3 weeks. I've never caused a disturbance. Atlas has never interacted with other customers, and I've never done anything to disrupt your business. The only disruption here is your decision to confront me about my disability." Wellington opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Janet appeared at his elbow. The server had been watching the confrontation from a distance, and her expression suggested she had something to say. "Mr. Wellington," Janet said, her voice respectful but firm, "I've been serving Miss Chun for weeks now. She's been nothing but polite and respectful, and her dog has never caused any problems." "Maybe we should—" "Janet," Wellington interrupted. "This isn't your concern. Please return to your other tables." Janet's expression hardened. "Sir, with respect, Miss Chun is my customer, and I don't think she should be treated this way. She's a veteran who served our country, and she deserves better than this." Wellington's face flushed with anger. "Janet, I appreciate your concern, but I'm the owner of this establishment, and I make the decisions about who can and cannot dine here. Now please, return to your work." Janet looked at Sarah, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "This isn't right." Sarah smiled at the woman, touched by her support. "Thank you, Janet. You don't need to apologize for someone else's choices." As Janet reluctantly returned to her other tables, Sarah noticed that other staff members were watching the confrontation with obvious discomfort. The hostess who had seated her looked near tears, and she could see kitchen staff peering through the service window. Wellington's decision to confront her wasn't just affecting his relationship with her, it was creating tension throughout his entire establishment. The police arrived 15 minutes later, 2 officers who entered the cafe with the kind of professional calm that suggested they'd dealt with similar situations before. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as they approached, Her military training had taught her to be wary of authority figures, and her experiences as a disabled veteran had shown her that not all law enforcement officers understood disability rights. The first officer was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a patient demeanor. His name tag read Officer Martinez, and he approached their table with the sort of careful neutrality that suggested he was trying to understand the situation before making any judgments. The second officer was younger, a woman whose posture suggested military training and whose expression indicated she was paying close attention to every detail. "Good afternoon," Officer Martinez said, addressing both Sarah and Wellington. "I understand there's been some kind of dispute here. Would someone like to explain what's happening?" Wellington stepped forward immediately, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of being in charge. "Officer, I'm the owner of this establishment, and I've asked this woman to leave because she's brought an animal into my restaurant. She's refusing to comply with my request." Officer Martinez nodded and turned to Sarah. "Ma'am, would you like to explain your perspective?" Sarah straightened, drawing on her military training to present herself professionally. "Officer Martinez, I'm Sarah Chun, a disabled veteran. Atlas here is my service dog, and he's legally permitted to accompany me in public establishments under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Mr. Wellington is asking me to leave because of my disability, which constitutes discrimination under federal law." Officer Martinez looked at Atlas, who remained perfectly still under the table. "Is this a trained service dog, ma'am?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "He's been trained to assist me with PTSD, mobility issues, and other service-connected disabilities. He's certified and up to date on all health requirements." The younger officer, whose name tag read Officer Davis, spoke up. "Mr. Wellington, are you familiar with the 8A requirements regarding service dogs?" Wellington's expression suggested he was becoming less confident in his position. "I know there are laws, but I also have rights as a business owner. I can't be forced to allow animals in my restaurant if they make other customers uncomfortable." "Sir," Officer Davis said, "the ADA is very clear about service dogs. They're not considered pets or animals in the legal sense. They're medical equipment. Business owners are required to allow service dogs in their establishments, unless the dog poses a direct threat to health or safety." Wellington gestured toward Atlas. "How do I know this is really a service dog and not just a pet? People lie about these things all the time." Officer Martinez looked at Sarah. "Ma'am, under the 8A, we're allowed to ask 2 questions. Is this a service dog, and what task is the dog trained to perform?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, Atlas is a service dog. He's trained to provide pressure therapy for panic attacks, to interrupt nightmares, to guide me when I'm disoriented, and to create barriers between me and crowds when I'm experiencing hypervigilance. And those are all legitimate medical tasks," Officer Davis added, looking at Wellington. "Sir, based on what I'm hearing, this woman has the legal right to be here with her service dog. There's no legal basis for asking her to leave." Wellington's face was growing redder. "But what about my other customers? What about their rights?" Officer Martinez spoke patiently. "Sir, the comfort preferences of other customers don't override the legal rights of disabled individuals. If someone is uncomfortable around service dogs, they have the right to leave, but you don't have the right to exclude someone because of their disability." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. The officers clearly understood the law and were prepared to enforce it. But she also felt a deep sadness about the entire situation, the fact that she needed police intervention to enjoy a simple lunch in a neighborhood cafe spoke to the ongoing struggles that disabled veterans faced in civilian life. Wellington looked around the restaurant, perhaps hoping to find support from other customers. Instead, he found most people watching the confrontation with expressions ranging from embarrassment to disapproval. The situation he'd created to make Sarah feel isolated and unwelcome had backfired, making him look like the aggressor. "Officers," Wellington said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence, "I'm trying to run a business here. I can't have situations like this disrupting my establishment." "Sir," Officer Davis said, "the only disruption here is your decision to confront a customer about her disability. If you'd simply allowed her to eat her lunch, there wouldn't be any situation to disrupt your business." Wellington's expression shifted, and Sarah could see him beginning to realize the legal and public relations implications of his actions. "I was just trying to protect my other customers," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Officer Martinez nodded. "I understand your concern, sir, but the law is clear. Service dogs are allowed in all public accommodations, including restaurants. They're trained to be unobtrusive and to focus solely on their handler's needs." Sarah watched as Wellington struggled with the reality of his situation. She could see him calculating the potential consequences: legal action, bad publicity, loss of customers who disagreed with his actions. But she could also see something else in his expression, a fundamental inability to understand why her needs should matter more than his preferences. "Fine," Wellington said finally, his voice tight with frustration. "But if that dog causes any problems at all, I want you both out of here immediately." Officer Davis shook her head. "Sir, that's not how this works. You can't place conditions on someone's right to public accommodation. If the dog actually caused a disruption, which, given its training, is highly unlikely, then you might have grounds for action. But you can't threaten to exclude someone based on hypothetical future problems." Wellington's jaw worked as he searched for a response. Around them, the restaurant had fallen silent again, other diners openly watching the resolution of the confrontation. Sarah could see some people nodding in approval, while others looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Mr. Wellington," Officer Martinez said, "I'd suggest you use this as a learning opportunity. The 8A has been in effect for over 30 years, and service dogs have been legally protected for just as long. Understanding these laws isn't just about avoiding legal trouble, it's about creating an inclusive environment for all your customers." Wellington nodded stiffly, but Sarah could see that he was complying with the officer's direction rather than truly understanding the principles involved. She suspected that once the police left, he would find other ways to make her feel unwelcome, subtle discouragements that would be harder to prove, but no less effective at pushing her away. The officers turned to leave, but Officer Davis paused at their table. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "thank you for your service. And I'm sorry you had to deal with this situation." Sarah smiled at the young officer. "Thank you, Officer Davis. I appreciate your understanding of the law and your willingness to enforce it." As the officers left the cafe, Sarah settled back into her booth, feeling emotionally drained by the confrontation. Atlas immediately adjusted his position, pressing closer against her leg in the way he'd been trained to provide comfort after stressful situations. She placed a hand on his head, drawing strength from his steady presence. The restaurant slowly returned to normal, conversations resuming as people processed what they'd witnessed. Sarah noticed that several diners were looking at her with expressions of respect and support, while others seemed to be deliberately avoiding eye contact. The confrontation had revealed the fault lines that existed in public opinion about disability rights and service dogs. Janet appeared at their table with a fresh cup of coffee and a sympathetic smile. "I'm so sorry about that," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have had to go through that." "Thank you, Janet," Sarah replied. "I appreciate your support during the confrontation." "My son would be furious if he knew what happened here," Janet said. "He's told me about the dogs that serve with our military, and he has nothing but respect for them and their handlers." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Your son sounds like a good man. I hope he stays safe out there." "He's coming home next month," Janet said, her voice carrying a mother's relief. "And when he does, I'm going to tell him about what happened here today." He'll want to know that there are people like you fighting for respect and recognition here. At home, as Janet returned to her other tables, Sarah reflected on the events of the afternoon. She'd come to the cafe hoping for a quiet lunch and had instead found herself in a confrontation that had tested her resolve and her understanding of her own rights. The experience had been exhausting and emotionally draining, but it had also been illuminating. She thought about Wellington's reaction to her presence, the way he'd immediately assumed that her needs were less important than the comfort of his other customers. She thought about the other diners who had watched the confrontation, some supporting her right to be there while others seemed to question whether she really belonged. And she thought about the officers who had understood the law and been willing to enforce it, providing the kind of protection that made her rights meaningful rather than theoretical. Atlas remained calm and alert throughout her reflections, his presence a constant reminder of the partnership that made her civilian life possible. He wasn't just a service dog, he was a bridge between her military service and her current life, a living symbol of the accommodations that had been earned through sacrifice and struggle. As Sarah finally opened her menu to order lunch, she realized that the confrontation with Wellington was probably not the end of her story. Word of what had happened would spread through the community, and she suspected that some people would see her as a troublemaker who had disrupted a local business. Others might view her as a hero who had stood up for disability rights. But regardless of how others saw her, she knew that she had done the right thing by refusing to be intimidated or shamed into leaving. The afternoon sun slanted through the cafe windows, casting warm light across her table. Atlas dozed quietly at her feet, his job done for the moment, but his alertness never fully diminished. Sarah ordered a sandwich and settled in to enjoy her meal, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to advocate for herself and others like her. She thought about the letter she would write to the local newspaper, documenting what had happened and explaining the importance of disability rights. She thought about the complaint she would file with the Department of Justice, ensuring that Wellington's actions would be officially documented and investigated. And she thought about the conversations she would have with other veterans, sharing her experience and encouraging them to stand up for their own rights. But most of all, she thought about the simple pleasure of eating lunch in a neighborhood cafe, accompanied by her service dog and surrounded by people who were slowly learning to see her as she truly was. Not a problem to be solved or a disruption to be managed, but a person with rights, dignity, and the same desire for community and connection that brought everyone else through these doors. The story of what happened at Bella Vista Cafe was just beginning, and Sarah Chun was ready to see where it would lead. The next morning brought a steady drizzle that matched Sarah's mood as she sat at her kitchen table, laptop open, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Atlas lay beside her chair, his presence a comforting constant as she struggled to find the right words for the complaint she was drafting to the Department of Justice. The events at Bella Vista Cafe had replayed in her mind throughout a restless night, each detail etched with the kind of clarity that came from years of military training, and the hypervigilance that PTSD had burned into her consciousness. She had awakened at 0400 hours, as she did most mornings, her internal clock still synchronized to military time despite 2 years of civilian life. The pre-dawn darkness had felt oppressive, filled with the echoes of Wellington's dismissive voice and the memory of feeling exposed and vulnerable in front of a room full of strangers. Atlas had sensed her distress immediately, providing the deep pressure therapy that helped ground her when the memories of combat and the realities of discrimination collided in her mind. Writing the complaint required her to relive every moment of the confrontation, to document each instance of Wellington's refusal to accommodate her disability, to translate her emotional experience into the clinical language that government bureaucrats would understand. She wrote about arriving at the cafe with legitimate expectations of service, about Wellington's immediate assumption that Atlas posed a threat, about his willingness to call police rather than acknowledge her legal rights, Each sentence felt like a small victory against the voice in her head that whispered she should have just left quietly, avoided the confrontation, accepted that some battles weren't worth fighting. The complaint would be just the beginning. Sarah had spent the morning researching Wellington's business, discovering that Bella Vista Cafe was part of a small chain of restaurants that prided themselves on community involvement and local charm. Their website featured smiling families, diverse groups of friends sharing meals, and testimonials about the welcoming atmosphere that made everyone feel at home. The irony was sharp enough to cut glass. She had also researched Wellington himself, finding a man who served on the local Chamber of Commerce, who donated to veterans' charities, who spoke publicly about supporting the troops. His LinkedIn profile featured photos from military appreciation events, and his restaurant had participated in fundraisers for wounded warriors. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could someone who claimed to support veterans turn around and discriminate against one who needed accommodations to function in civilian life? Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her documentation process. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something about the area code seemed familiar. She answered cautiously, Atlas immediately moving to position himself where he could monitor her stress levels. "Is this Sarah Chun?" The voice was female, professional but warm. "Yes, this is Sarah. Miss Chun, my name is Maria Rodriguez, and I'm a reporter with the Metro City Tribune. I received a tip about an incident yesterday at Bella Vista Cafe involving discrimination against a service dog. Would you be willing to speak with me about what happened?" Sarah's stomach tightened. She had expected word to spread through the community, but she hadn't anticipated media attention so quickly. "How did you hear about this?" "One of the other diners contacted our newsroom," Rodriguez explained. "They were disturbed by what they witnessed and felt it needed to be brought to public attention. I've been covering disability rights issues for several years, and I'm familiar with the challenges that veterans face when trying to access public accommodations." Sarah considered the offer carefully. Speaking to the media would make her story public in a way that could help other disabled veterans, but it would also open her to scrutiny and potential backlash from people who disagreed with her position. She thought about the unsigned note she'd once received during military training, the voices that said she didn't belong, the constant pressure to prove that her needs were legitimate. "Miss Chun," Rodriguez continued, "I want you to know that my coverage would focus on the broader issues of disability rights and veteran services. This isn't about creating controversy, it's about education and advocacy." "Can I think about it?" Sarah asked. "Of course. Here's my number if you decide you'd like to talk." After ending the call, Sarah sat staring at her laptop screen, the cursor blinking in the document that documented her experience. Atlas moved closer, sensing her uncertainty and positioning himself to provide the calming pressure that helped her think clearly. She had spent years learning to navigate the complex landscape of veteran services and disability rights, understanding that her individual experiences were part of larger systemic issues that affected thousands of people. The phone rang again, this time showing a number she recognized, her former Marine Unit's informal communication network that kept veterans connected across the country. She answered to hear the familiar voice of Sergeant Maria Santos, her former squad leader, and one of the few people who truly understood the challenges of being a female veteran with invisible disabilities. "Chun, what the hell happened yesterday?" Santos's voice carried the kind of direct concern that had made her an effective leader in combat situations. "Rodriguez in Chicago called me, said she heard through the grapevine that some restaurant owner gave you trouble about Atlas." Sarah felt relief wash over her at hearing Santos's voice. Word travels fast in the veteran community. Damn right it does. Especially when one of our own gets disrespected. "Rodriguez said the guy actually called the cops on you." "He did. Fortunately, the officers understood the law and sided with me. But Santos, it was humiliating. The whole restaurant watching, everyone staring, having to justify my right to exist in a public space. Santos was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could almost hear her processing the information with the tactical mindset that had served them both in Afghanistan. Chun, this isn't just about you anymore. This is about every veteran who's going to walk into that restaurant or any other business with a service dog. This is about setting a precedent. I know, Sarah replied. I'm filing a DOJ complaint, and there's a reporter who wants to interview me about it. Good, do the interview. Tell your story. Make sure people understand what really happened. Santos, you know how this goes. Half the people will support me, and half will think I'm making trouble over nothing. They'll say I should have just left, that I was being difficult, that service dogs don't belong in restaurants. Let them say it, Santos replied firmly. You know what you'll also get? You'll get messages from veterans who've been through this same thing, but didn't have the strength to fight back. You'll get thanked by people who need to know that someone's willing to stand up for their rights. Chun, you didn't serve 2 tours in Afghanistan to come home and accept discrimination from some small-town restaurant owner. After the call ended, Sarah returned to her laptop with renewed determination. She finished the DOJ complaint, carefully documenting every aspect of the incident and ensuring that her language was precise and professional. She attached copies of Atlas's certification documents, her own disability ratings from the Veterans Administration, and a detailed timeline of events. The complaint would trigger an investigation that could result in fines, mandatory training, or other corrective actions for Wellington's business. She also began drafting an email to Maria Rodriguez, accepting the interview request. If her story could help other veterans navigate similar situations, if it could educate business owners about their obligations under federal law, if it could contribute to a broader understanding of the challenges faced by disabled veterans, then the personal discomfort would be worthwhile. The rain continued outside, creating a steady rhythm against her apartment windows. Bliss had settled into his afternoon rest position, but Sarah could see that he remained alert to her emotional state, ready to provide assistance if her stress levels escalated. She marveled at his ability to balance professional vigilance with personal comfort, to be both a medical device and a companion, to represent the bridge between her military service and her civilian life. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender was Janet, the server from Bella Vista Cafe, and the subject line read, "Thank you and I'm sorry." Sarah opened the message to find a heartfelt note expressing support for her actions and shame about Wellington's behavior. Janet wrote that she had been thinking about the incident all night, that she had discussed it with her son who was deployed overseas, and that he had encouraged her to reach out with support and solidarity. The email continued with information that Sarah found both encouraging and troubling. Several staff members at the cafe had expressed discomfort with Wellington's actions, with some questioning whether they wanted to continue working for someone who would discriminate against disabled veterans. Janet also mentioned that she had heard from other customers who had witnessed the incident, some expressing support for Sarah's position, while others defended Wellington's right to manage his business as he saw fit. Most significantly, Janet revealed that Wellington had called a staff meeting that morning to discuss policies regarding animals in the restaurant. According to Janet, he had presented the incident as a learning experience, but had also emphasized his authority as the business owner to maintain standards that protected all customers. The message was clear. While he would comply with legal requirements, he had not fundamentally changed his attitude toward disabled patrons and their service animals. Sarah felt a familiar anger building as she read about Wellington's continued resistance to understanding the principles behind disability rights law. His compliance was grudging and minimal, focused on avoiding legal consequences rather than creating an inclusive environment. She realized that her confrontation with him had been just the beginning of a longer struggle to change hearts and minds in addition to enforcing legal requirements. She spent the afternoon researching similar cases, finding dozens of examples of businesses that had discriminated against people with service dogs, despite clear legal protections. The patterns were depressingly familiar: business owners who claimed to support veterans while refusing to accommodate their disabilities, establishments that welcomed normal customers while treating disabled patrons as problems to be managed, communities that praised service members' sacrifice while failing to support their reintegration into civilian life. But she also found examples of positive change: businesses that had learned from their mistakes and become advocates for disability rights, communities that had rallied around veterans facing discrimination, legal victories that had strengthened protections and increased awareness. The struggle was ongoing, but progress was possible when people were willing to speak up and demand better. As evening approached, Sarah made her decision about the media interview. She called Maria Rodriguez and agreed to meet the following day, with the understanding that her story would be part of a broader examination of veteran services and disability rights in the community. The reporter seemed knowledgeable about the issues and committed to accurate, respectful coverage that would focus on systemic problems rather than personal drama. The conversation with Rodriguez revealed additional information about the community response to Sarah's experience. The reporter had been contacted by several veterans organizations, expressing support and offering assistance with any legal action. Local disability rights advocates had also reached out, seeing Sarah's case as an opportunity to educate the public about service dog rights and the ongoing challenges faced by disabled veterans. Rodriguez also mentioned that she had attempted to contact Wellington for comment, but had been referred to his attorney, suggesting that he was taking the potential legal and public relations consequences seriously. His restaurant's social media pages had been flooded with comments, both supporting and criticizing his actions, creating a public debate about disability rights that extended far beyond the original incident. That evening, Sarah sat on her apartment balcony with Atlas beside her, watching the city lights emerge as darkness fell. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and fresh, and she felt a sense of clarity about the path forward. Tomorrow would bring the media interview with all its potential consequences and opportunities. Her DOJ complaint would work its way through the bureaucratic process, potentially resulting in changes that would help other disabled veterans. The local veteran and disability rights communities would continue their advocacy work using her experience as a catalyst for broader discussions about inclusion and accommodation. She thought about her time in Afghanistan, about the missions where success depended on every team member, understanding their role and supporting each other regardless of differences. The principles that had guided her military service: courage, commitment, and a willingness to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves, were just as relevant in civilian life. The battles were different, fought in courtrooms and news articles rather than on foreign battlefields, but the stakes were equally important. Atlas sensed her reflective mood and moved closer, his warm presence a reminder of the partnership that made her advocacy possible. He wasn't just her service dog, he was a symbol of the accommodations that allowed disabled veterans to participate fully in civilian life, a living demonstration of the effectiveness of assistive technology, and a bridge between the military and civilian communities that sometimes struggle to understand each other. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. From Santos: "Saw the Tribune reporter is covering your story. Good. Make sure you mention how this affects all of us, not just you. This is bigger than one restaurant." She typed back, "Roger that. Interview tomorrow. We'll make sure the broader issues get covered." Santos responded immediately, "Proud of you, Chen. You're doing what we trained you to do, completing the mission and taking care of your team." As Sarah prepared for bed, she reflected on the unexpected direction her life had taken. She had come to Bella Vista Cafe looking for nothing more than a quiet lunch and a sense of community connection. Instead, she had found herself at the center of a civil rights battle that would test her resilience and potentially impact the lives of countless other disabled veterans. The challenge ahead would require the same skills that had served her. In military combat, strategic thinking, clear communication, and the ability to maintain focus under pressure. But it would also require new skills that she was still developing: the ability to navigate media attention, to work within legal and bureaucratic systems, and to build coalitions among diverse groups of supporters. Atlas settled into his nighttime. Positioned beside her bed, his presence a constant reminder that she wasn't facing these challenges alone. The partnership they had built was stronger than any discrimination they might encounter, more resilient than any attempt to make them feel unwelcome, and more powerful than any voice that said they didn't belong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to advocate for change. Sarah Chun was ready to meet them with the same determination that had carried her through military service and would continue to guide her through the battles ahead. The mission was different, but the commitment remained the same: protect those who needed protection, stand up for what was right, and never accept that discrimination was simply the price of participation in civilian life. The story of what happened at Bella Vista Cafe was spreading beyond the boundaries of her community, becoming part of a larger conversation about veteran services and disability rights. Sarah understood that her individual experience had become something larger than herself, and she was prepared to carry that responsibility with the same honor and dedication that had defined her military service. The morning of the interview dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through Sarah's apartment windows with the kind of brightness that felt like an omen. She had slept better than expected, Atlas's steady breathing beside her bed providing the familiar comfort that allowed her mind to rest. But as consciousness returned and the day's significance settled over her, she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded high-stakes situations. Maria Rodriguez arrived precisely on time, carrying a professional camera bag and the kind of confident energy that came from years of investigative journalism. She was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes and the sort of direct manner that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries when important stories needed telling. "Ms. Chun, thank you for agreeing to speak with me," Rodriguez said as she settled into Sarah's living room. "Before we begin, I want you to know that several other veterans have reached out since word of your story began spreading. They're hoping that speaking up will help prevent others from experiencing what you went through." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and responsibility at those words. Atlas positioned himself between her and the reporter, not out of suspicion but as a matter of standard protocol, ready to provide intervention if the stress of the interview triggered any of Sarah's symptoms. Rodriguez noticed the dog's positioning and smiled with recognition rather than confusion. "I've interviewed veterans with service dogs before," Rodriguez explained. "I understand that Atlas isn't just a pet he's working right now, monitoring your well-being and ready to assist if needed." The interview began with Rodriguez asking about Sarah's military background, her path to needing a service dog, and the challenges of transitioning to civilian life. Sarah found herself speaking more openly than she had expected, describing the invisible nature of many combat injuries and the way that PTSD could make simple civilian activities feel like military operations requiring careful planning and constant vigilance. "People see a young woman with a dog and they make assumptions," Sarah explained. "They assume I'm faking my disability because I don't use a wheelchair or a cane. They assume Atlas is an emotional support animal rather than a trained medical device. They assume that if I can walk and talk and appear functional, then I don't really need accommodations." Rodriguez nodded, taking careful notes while maintaining eye contact that encouraged Sarah to continue. "What people don't understand is that Atlas has been trained to recognize the early signs of panic attacks, to provide deep pressure therapy when I'm experiencing flashbacks, to create physical barriers between me and crowds when my hypervigilance becomes overwhelming. He's not just offering comfort, he's performing specific medical tasks that allow me to function in environments that would otherwise be impossible for me to navigate. The conversation turned to the incident at Bella Vista Cafe with Rodriguez, asking detailed questions about Wellington's behavior and the escalation of the confrontation. Sarah found herself reliving each moment of the encounter, from the initial welcoming atmosphere to the gradual realization that she was being targeted for discrimination to the final intervention by law enforcement. "What struck me most," Sarah said, "was Wellington's assumption that his other customers' comfort was more important than my legal rights. He kept talking about protecting his business and maintaining standards, but what he was really saying was that disabled people like me don't belong in spaces where normal people are trying to enjoy themselves." Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. "Have you experienced this kind of discrimination before?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Not this blatantly, but yes. The challenges are usually more subtle businesses that reluctantly allow Atlas, but make it clear we're not really welcome. Staff who hover nervously and make other customers uncomfortable. People who question whether I really need a service. Dog because my disabilities aren't visible." Wellington was just more direct about his prejudices than most people. The reporter asked about the response from the veteran community, and Sarah described the outpouring of support she had received from former military colleagues and advocacy organizations. "What's become clear is that my experience wasn't isolated. Veterans across the country deal with similar discrimination on a regular basis. The difference is that most of them don't have the energy or resources to fight back, so the discrimination continues unchallenged." Rodriguez had done her homework, presenting Sarah with statistics about service dog discrimination and the challenges of enforcing ADA compliance. According to disability rights organizations, complaints about service dog access denials have increased significantly over the past 5 years. "Why do you think that is?" Sarah thought about the question while Atlas adjusted his position slightly, maintaining his vigilant watch over her stress levels. "I think there are several factors. First, more veterans are returning from overseas deployments with invisible injuries that require service dog assistance. Second, there's been an increase in fake service dogs, pets that people pass off as working animals, which has made some business owners skeptical of all service dogs. And third, there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what service dogs do and why they're legally protected." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics from the training requirements for legitimate service dogs to the legal remedies available when discrimination occurs. Rodriguez asked thoughtful questions about the broader implications of Sarah's case and the potential for systemic change in how businesses approach disability accommodation. "Ms. Chun," Rodriguez said as the interview neared its end, "what do you hope will come from speaking out about your experience?" Sarah looked down at Atlas, who had remained perfectly professional throughout the entire interview, his presence a constant reminder of the partnership that made her advocacy possible. "I hope that other veterans will understand they don't have to accept discrimination silently. I hope that business owners will take the time to educate themselves about their legal obligations and the importance of creating inclusive environments. And I hope that the general public will develop a better understanding of invisible disabilities and the role that service dogs play in helping veterans reintegrate into civilian life." Rodriguez packed up her equipment with the efficiency of someone who had conducted thousands of interviews. "The article will run in tomorrow's edition, and I'll make sure you have a chance to review the quotes for accuracy. I appreciate your willingness to share your story. It takes courage to put yourself in the public eye for the sake of others." After Rodriguez left, Sarah felt both drained and energized by the experience. The interview had forced her to articulate not just what had happened, but why it mattered, to connect her individual experience to broader patterns of discrimination and systemic barriers faced by disabled veterans. Atlas sensed her emotional state and provided the deep pressure therapy that helped her decompress from high-stress situations. The rest of the day brought a steady stream of phone calls and messages from people who had heard upcoming article. Some were supportive veterans sharing their own experiences with discrimination, disability advocates offering assistance with legal action, community members expressing outrage about Wellington's behavior. Others were less encouraging, anonymous callers suggesting she was making trouble over nothing, social media comments questioning the legitimacy of her disability, and veiled threats from people who felt she was attacking local business owners. Sarah had expected the mixed response, understanding that disability rights remained a contentious issue for many people. But she was unprepared for the intensity of some of the negative reactions, the personal attacks that questioned not just her position but her character, her military service, and her right to speak up about discrimination. One particularly disturbing voicemail came from someone who claimed to know Wellington personally and accused Sarah of targeting his business for financial gain. "You military types are all the same," the caller said. "Always looking for someone to blame for your problems, always expecting special treatment. That man built his business from nothing, and you're trying to destroy it because you can't handle being around normal people." Atlas immediately responded to Sarah's elevated stress levels, moving to provide calming pressure while she played the message. The caller's words stung not just because of their cruelty, but because they reflected attitudes that Sarah knew were shared by others in the community. The idea that seeking legal protection from discrimination was somehow equivalent to demanding special treatment revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both disability rights and military service. But for every negative response, Sarah received 2 or 3 messages of support. A local veterans organization called to offer legal assistance as she decided to pursue civil action against Wellington. A disability rights lawyer reached out to discuss the broader implications of her case and the potential for setting precedents that would help other veterans. Most meaningfully, she heard from other service dog handlers who shared their own stories of discrimination and expressed gratitude that someone was willing to speak up publicly. One call came from Master Sergeant Jennifer Williams, a veteran Sarah didn't know personally, but who had served in similar units in Afghanistan. Williams had been following Sarah's story through military networks and wanted to offer both support and information. "Shun," Williams said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of military leadership. "I've been dealing with this kind of discrimination for 3 years now, ever since I got my service dog for TBI and PTSD. The difference is I've been fighting these battles quietly, filing complaints that disappear into bureaucratic black holes, educating business owners one at a time. What you're doing, making it public, forcing people to confront their prejudices, that's what it's going to take to create real change." Williams went on to describe a network of veterans who had been documenting service dog discrimination across the country, collecting evidence of systemic problems that went far beyond individual incidents. "Sarah, your case isn't just about one restaurant owner in one city. It's about a pattern of discrimination that affects thousands of veterans who are trying to rebuild their lives in civilian communities." The conversation with Williams revealed the scope of the problem Sarah had inadvertently stepped into. Veterans with service dogs face discrimination in restaurants, stores, hotels, transportation, and even medical facilities. Many businesses claimed ignorance of ADA requirements, while others openly questioned the legitimacy of service dogs or the disabilities they were trained to assist. The result was a civilian landscape that remained largely inaccessible to veterans who needed accommodation to participate fully in community life. Williams also warned Sarah about the potential consequences of speaking out publicly. "You're going to get pushback not just from people who disagree with your position, but from people who see you as a threat to the status quo. Some veterans will even criticize you for making trouble or drawing attention to disabilities that they prefer to keep private. You need to be prepared for a long fight that extends far beyond this one incident. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Janet from Bella Vista Cafe appeared at her door, looking nervous but determined. She carried a manila envelope and the kind of expression that suggested she had something important to say. "I'm sorry to bother you at home," Janet said, "but I needed to give you this, and I didn't want to do it at work where Wellington might see." The envelope contained photocopies of internal restaurant documents, staff memos about policies regarding animals, customer complaint logs that showed previous incidents involving service dogs, and email exchanges between Wellington and his corporate office about ADA compliance. The documents revealed a pattern of discrimination that went far beyond Sarah's individual experience. "He's done this before," Janet explained, her voice tight with anger. "There have been at least 6 incidents in the past 2 years where he's refused service to people with service dogs. Most of them just left rather than fight about it. But he's been keeping records of the problems caused by allowing animals in the restaurant." Sarah studied the documents with growing outrage. Wellington's emails to corporate revealed his true attitudes about disability accommodation, describing service dogs as disruptive influences and liability risks that interfered with the restaurant's family-friendly atmosphere. One particularly damning email suggested that the company should consider relocating to a jurisdiction with more reasonable interpretations of ADA requirements. "Janet, why are you showing me this?" Sarah asked. "Because it's not right," Janet replied simply. "I've been working in food service for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like his behavior toward people with disabilities. He treats service dogs like they're wild animals, and he treats their handlers like they're trying to scam him. When I think about my son coming home from deployment and potentially needing accommodations, the idea that he might face this kind of treatment makes me sick." Janet went on to explain that several staff members had become increasingly uncomfortable with Wellington's policies, with some considering resignation rather than participate in discrimination. "We're supposed to be serving the community, including the veterans who've served our country. What Wellington is doing isn't just illegal, it's morally wrong." The documents Janet provided would significantly strengthen Sarah's case if she decided to pursue legal action. They demonstrated a pattern of discriminatory behavior rather than an isolated incident, showed that Wellington was aware of ADA requirements but chose to ignore them, and revealed corporate knowledge of ongoing compliance problems. The evidence transformed Sarah's individual complaint into a potential class action that could help multiple victims of discrimination. After Janet left, Sarah spent the evening reviewing the documents and considering their implications. The evidence revealed that her confrontation with Wellington had been inevitable, if not her. Then another veteran, another service dog handler, another person who refused to accept discrimination silently. Wellington's behavior wasn't aberrational but systematic, part of a deliberate policy of exclusion that had been operating under the radar for years. Sarah called her lawyer contact from the Disability Rights Organization, sharing the new evidence and discussing the potential for expanded legal action. The attorney was excited about the documents, explaining that pattern evidence significantly strengthened both individual complaints and broader civil rights cases. "Sarah," the lawyer said, "with this evidence, we're not just talking about one incident of discrimination. We're talking about a business that has systematically violated federal law and the civil rights of disabled veterans. This could result in significant penalties, mandatory training, and policy changes that protect future customers." The conversation also revealed additional victims who had filed complaints against Wellington's restaurant, veterans whose experiences matched Sarah's but who had been reluctant to speak publicly about their treatment. With the new evidence and growing media attention, several of them were reconsidering their silence and exploring the possibility of joining a coordinated legal response. As Sarah prepared for bed, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few days. She had entered Bella Vista Cafe as someone seeking quiet community connection and had emerged as an unwilling but committed advocate for veterans' rights and disability accommodation. The transition felt both overwhelming and inevitable, as if her military training and personal experience had been preparing her for exactly this kind of mission. Atlas settled into his nighttime position, his presence a reminder that her advocacy was grounded in real need and legitimate rights rather than abstract principles. The partnership they had built represented the kind of accommodation that made civilian life possible for thousands of veterans, and the discrimination they had faced represented barriers that affected entire communities of people who had served their country and deserved better treatment in return. Tomorrow would bring the publication of the Tribune article and the broader public response that would follow. Sarah understood that the real battle was just beginning, that changing hearts and minds would be more difficult than enforcing legal requirements, and that the personal cost of speaking up would continue to escalate as the story gained attention. But she also understood that the alternative, remaining silent while discrimination continued unchallenged, was unacceptable. Her military service had taught her that some missions were worth the personal cost, that protecting others sometimes required accepting risk, and that the most important battles were often fought by people who would have preferred to remain anonymous. The story of what happened at Bella Vista Cafe had become larger than Sarah had anticipated, connecting to networks of veterans, advocates, and community members who were ready to demand better treatment for disabled Americans. Sarah Shun was prepared to see that mission through to completion, regardless of the personal consequences that lay ahead. Atlas's steady breathing provided the soundtrack for her final thoughts of the day, a reminder that she wasn't facing these challenges alone and that the partnership that made her advocacy possible was stronger than any discrimination they might encounter. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to create change, and Sarah was ready to meet them with the same determination that had carried her through military service and would continue to guide her through the battles ahead. The Tribune article hit newsstands at 6 in the morning, and by 8 o'clock, Sarah's phone was ringing nonstop. The headline read, "Local Veteran Faces Restaurant Discrimination Despite Service Dog Rights," and Rodriguez had crafted a piece that balanced personal narrative with broader policy analysis in exactly the way Sarah had hoped. The article didn't just tell her story, it connected her experience to national patterns of discrimination and highlighted the ongoing challenges faced by disabled veterans across the country. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah's voicemail filled with messages from supporters and detractors, her email inbox flooded with interview requests from other media outlets, and her apartment building's lobby buzzing with reporters hoping to catch her for follow-up questions. Atlas remained calm throughout the chaos, his training allowing him to distinguish between normal excitement and genuine threats. But Sarah could see the subtle signs of increased alertness that suggested he was monitoring the situation carefully. By noon, the story had been picked up by national news networks, with CNN running a segment on veteran discrimination and Fox News featuring a debate about business owners' rights versus disability accommodation. Social media exploded with commentary, ranging from passionate support for Sarah's position to equally passionate defense of Wellington's actions. The hashtag veteran rights began trending, alongside hashtag service dog discrimination and hashtag support our troops, creating a digital battlefield where strangers argued about issues they had never personally confronted. The most significant development came in a phone call from Colonel Rebecca Hayes, whom Sarah recognized as a senior officer in Veteran Affairs Advocacy. Hayes explained that Sarah's case had caught the attention of congressional representatives who were already working on legislation to strengthen service dog protections and increase penalties for 8A violations. "Ms. Chun," Hayes said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of military leadership, "your willingness to speak up has created an opportunity to address systemic problems that affect thousands of veterans. We're seeing unprecedented public attention on these issues, and that attention translates to political pressure for meaningful change. Hayes went on to explain that several prominent veterans organizations were coordinating a response that would use Sarah's case as a catalyst for broader advocacy efforts. We're looking at congressional hearings, Department of Justice investigations, and public awareness campaigns that could fundamentally change how businesses approach disability accommodation. The conversation revealed the scope of what Sarah's individual act of resistance had unleashed. Her refusal to accept discrimination silently had connected to networks of advocacy and political action that operated at levels she had never imagined. The personal had become political in ways that felt both empowering and overwhelming. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that would change everything. Sarah opened her door to find a group of 20 Marines in dress uniforms, led by Master Sergeant David Rodriguez, a man whose bearing suggested combat experience and natural leadership. Behind him stood Marines of various ranks and backgrounds, all wearing the kind of serious expressions that indicated they were there on official business. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, snapping to attention and rendering a crisp salute. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines. We're here to request the honor of escorting you to lunch." Sarah returned the salute automatically, her military training overriding her confusion. "Sergeant, I'm not sure I understand." Rodriguez smiled for the first time since arriving. "Ma'am, word of your situation reached our unit yesterday. We've been following the news coverage, and we've decided that if a fellow Marine is being denied service because of her service-connected disabilities, then it's time for her unit to show up and demonstrate what support looks like." The realization hit Sarah like a physical force. These Marines intended to accompany her to Bella Vista Cafe to make a public statement about veteran solidarity and disability rights that would be impossible for Wellington or anyone else to ignore. "Sergeant, you don't need to do this." "With respect, ma'am," Rodriguez replied, "we disagree. You served 2 tours in Afghanistan, you've been injured in service to your country, and you've been discriminated against for seeking the accommodations you've earned. That makes this a unit issue, and Marines take care of their own." Sarah looked at the group of uniformed service members standing in her hallway, understanding that they represented something larger than individual support. They were making a statement about military values, about the obligations that service members had to each other, and about the kind of community that veterans deserve to find in civilian life. "Ma'am," Rodriguez continued, "we've reserved tables for the entire group at Bella Vista Cafe. We'd be honored if you and Atlas would join us for lunch. It's time for Mr. Wellington to understand exactly who he was disrespecting when he asked you to leave." The walk to the restaurant felt like a military operation, with 21 Marines moving information through the city streets. Sarah walked at the front with Rodriguez, Atlas maintaining his professional demeanor despite the obvious excitement of being surrounded by so many people. Passers-by stopped to watch the procession, some recognizing the significance of what they were witnessing, others simply curious about the unusual sight of uniformed military personnel moving with obvious purpose through the downtown area. Word of the Marines' plan had somehow reached local media, and Sarah could see news vans following at a discreet distance. She realized that what had started as a simple lunch invitation had become a public demonstration that would be broadcast across the country, transforming her individual experience into a symbol of broader issues about veteran treatment and disability rights. As they approached Bella Vista Cafe, Sarah could see Wellington standing in the window, his face pale with what looked like a mixture of panic and rage. The restaurant's parking lot was already filling with curious onlookers, and she could see staff members peering through the windows with expressions ranging from excitement to terror. Rodriguez held the door open for Sarah and Atlas, then followed them inside with the rest of the unit. The Marines filed in with military precision, filling every available table and creating an atmosphere of disciplined solidarity that transformed the entire space. Wellington stood behind the hostess station, clearly unsure how to respond to the situation he was facing. "Good afternoon," Rodriguez said, approaching Wellington with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed underlying steel. "We have reservations for 21. We're here to support our fellow Marine who was discriminated against in this establishment." Wellington's face cycled through several emotions before settling on something that looked like defeat. "Of course. Right this way." The Marines seated themselves with the efficiency of a unit that had operated together in challenging environments. Sarah found herself at a central table with Atlas positioned beside her, surrounded by service members who had made it clear that any further discrimination would be met with coordinated resistance. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was what community support looked like. This was how veterans took care of each other. And this was the kind of response that discrimination deserved. Wellington approached their table with obvious reluctance, his earlier confidence replaced by the uncomfortable realization that his actions had consequences he hadn't anticipated. "Ms. Chun," he said, his voice lacking the authority it had carried. "During their previous encounter, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding we had yesterday." Sarah looked at him steadily, Atlas remaining calm but alert beside her. "Mr. Wellington, there was no misunderstanding. You discriminated against me because of my disability, and you refused to acknowledge my legal rights under federal law." Wellington glanced around at the Marines surrounding them, clearly calculating the public relations implications of the situation. "I realize now that I may have been overly cautious about policies regarding service animals. I want you to know that you're welcome here, and I hope we can move forward positively." Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. "Sir, with respect, this isn't about moving forward. This is about taking responsibility for discriminatory actions and ensuring that no other veteran faces the same treatment." Wellington's discomfort was palpable. "Of course, I'm committed to ensuring that all customers, including veterans with service dogs, feel welcome in my establishment." Sarah studied Wellington's face, seeing calculation rather than genuine understanding in his expression. His apology was motivated by the public pressure and potential consequences he was facing, rather than any real change in his attitudes about disability accommodation. But she also recognized that sometimes external pressure was necessary to create the conditions for genuine change. "Mr. Wellington," she said, "I appreciate your apology, but words aren't enough. What concrete steps will you take to ensure that other disabled veterans don't face the discrimination I experienced?" Wellington looked around nervously before responding. "We'll be implementing comprehensive 8A training for all staff members, and we'll be updating our policies to clearly reflect our commitment to serving all customers, including those with service animals." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That's a good start, sir. We'll be checking back periodically to ensure that those commitments are being honored." The lunch proceeded with the Marines conducting themselves with perfect military courtesy, demonstrating the kind of professionalism and discipline that made it impossible for anyone to characterize their presence as disruptive or inappropriate. They ordered meals, engaged in quiet conversation, and treated the staff with respect while making it clear that they were there to support their fellow veteran. Sarah found herself surrounded by stories of other Marines who had faced similar challenges, other veterans who had been discriminated against because of invisible disabilities, other service members who had struggled to find their place in civilian communities that didn't always understand or appreciate their service. The shared experiences created a sense of solidarity that reminded her why military units were often described as families. They were groups of people who understood each other's challenges and were committed to mutual support. The media attention outside the restaurant continued to grow throughout the lunch, with local and national news outlets covering what had become a powerful symbol of veteran solidarity and disability rights advocacy. Sarah could see reporters interviewing passersby about their reactions to the demonstration, capturing public opinion about discrimination and military service that would help shape broader conversations about these issues. As the meal concluded, Rodriguez stood and addressed the restaurant. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the dining room, "we want to thank you for your attention today. We're here because one of our fellow Marines was discriminated against in this establishment because of her service-connected disabilities. We're here to demonstrate that veterans support each other, that discrimination against disabled Americans is unacceptable, and that businesses have both legal and moral obligations to provide equal service to all customers." The restaurant erupted in applause, with other diners clearly moved by the demonstration of solidarity they had witnessed. Wellington stood behind the counter, his expression suggesting that he was beginning to understand the broader implications of his actions and the community response they had generated. As the Marines prepared to leave, Rodriguez approached Sarah one final time. "Ma'am, you should know that your willingness to speak up has inspired veterans across the country. We've been getting calls from units nationwide, all expressing support and offering assistance if you need it. You've reminded us what it means to continue serving even after leaving active duty." Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked around at the Marines who had come to support her. "Sergeant, I can't adequately express what this means to me. When I was sitting in this restaurant yesterday, facing discrimination and feeling isolated, I never imagined that speaking up would lead to this kind of response." "Ma'am," Rodriguez replied, "that's what Marines do. We adapt, we overcome, and we take care of our own. Your fight is our fight, and we'll continue supporting you until real change happens." The weeks that followed brought a cascade of developments that transformed Sarah's individual experience into a catalyst for systemic change. The Department of Justice announced a comprehensive investigation into disability discrimination in public accommodations, using Sarah's case as a primary example of ongoing civil rights violations. Congressional representatives introduced legislation that would strengthen penalties for ADA violations and provide additional protections for service dog handlers. Wellington's restaurant chain faced a coordinated boycott from veterans organizations, ultimately agreeing to a settlement that included significant financial penalties, mandatory training for all employees, and ongoing monitoring by disability rights organizations. The corporate office issued a public apology acknowledging their responsibility for discrimination and committing to becoming a model for disability inclusion in the food service industry. Most significantly, Sarah's story inspired hundreds of other veterans to speak up about their own experiences with discrimination, creating a national conversation about the obstacles that disabled Americans faced in accessing public accommodations. Veterans organizations launched coordinated advocacy campaigns. Disability rights groups received increased funding and support, and business organizations began developing voluntary compliance programs that went beyond minimum legal requirements. Sarah found herself invited to speak at congressional hearings, veterans conferences, and disability rights events across the country. Atlas accompanied her to every appearance, serving as both a working service dog and a living symbol of the accommodations that made full participation in civilian life possible for thousands of disabled veterans. 6 months after the incident at Bella Vista Cafe, Sarah received a letter from a young Marine who had recently returned from deployment with injuries that required a service dog. The letter thanked her for creating a path that other veterans could follow, for showing that discrimination could be challenged successfully, and for demonstrating that speaking up about injustice was both a right and a responsibility. The letter reminded Sarah of why her individual act of resistance had been so important. It wasn't just about her right to eat lunch in a neighborhood cafe, or Wellington's obligation to follow federal law. It was about creating a society where all Americans, including those who had been injured in service to their country, could participate fully in community life without facing discrimination or exclusion. Sarah kept the letter on her desk, next to the photograph of her receiving the commendation for her advocacy work from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Atlas lay beside her chair as she worked on her memoir, chronicling the journey from a simple lunch outing to a national movement for veteran and disability rights. The memoir would tell the complete story, the discrimination she had faced, the support she had received, and the changes that had resulted from her refusal to accept injustice silently. But it would also tell a larger story about the ongoing struggle for civil rights, the power of community solidarity, and the responsibility that all Americans had to protect the most vulnerable members of society. As Sarah wrote, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that day at Bella Vista Cafe. She had entered the restaurant as someone seeking quiet community, connection, and had emerged as a national advocate for veteran and disability rights. The transformation had been unexpected and sometimes overwhelming, but it had also been deeply meaningful. Atlas stirred beside her chair, sensing her reflective mood and providing the gentle pressure that helped her stay grounded in the present moment. Their partnership had been the foundation for everything that followed: the confrontation with Wellington, the media attention, the legal action, and the broader advocacy work that continued to grow. The story of what happened at Bella Vista Cafe had become larger than either of them could have imagined, connecting to networks of veterans, advocates, and community members who were committed to creating a more inclusive society. Sarah Chun had proven that individual acts of resistance could create systemic change, that speaking up about injustice was both necessary and powerful, and that the values learned in military service, courage, commitment, and taking care of your fellow service members, remained relevant and important in civilian life. The mission was far from over. Discrimination against disabled veterans continued. Businesses still struggled to understand their legal obligations, and society as a whole needed ongoing education about the challenges faced by Americans with disabilities. But Sarah had proven that change was possible when people were willing to stand up, speak out, and demand better treatment for themselves and others. Atlas's steady presence beside her served as a constant reminder of why the work was important and why it would continue. The partnership they had built represented the kind of accommodation that made full participation in civilian life possible, and the discrimination they had faced represented barriers that affected entire communities of people who deserved better. As Sarah finished another chapter of her memoir, she smiled at the photograph on her desk, not the commendation from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, but a picture from that day at Bella Vista Cafe, showing her surrounded by 20 Marines who had come to demonstrate what solidarity looked like. The image captured everything she hoped people would remember about her story: that veterans take care of each other, that discrimination deserves coordinated resistance, and that the most important battles are often fought by ordinary people who refuse to accept that injustice is simply the price of participation in American life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.